Gail McGlamery. I'm a fiber artist, weaver, spinner, dyer. I think I just like it because it's about working with color. It's very tactile. I make functional things a lot of the time, and I like the practicality of it. It's also very mathematical, so it's both the creative and the structured part of my brain. So it's fully creative to me, very fulfilling. My mother gave me my first loom. She was a painter, dabbled in weaving, lots of different things. Had no idea how to use it, and it was a floor loom. So I took a class at Halcyon down in Bath just to demystify it, and after that just started teaching myself. Kind of a lot of it's like any craft, you just kind of have to keep working it and get used to it to learn it. Fiber is kind of a slippery slope, and I'm not a knitter at all. And so getting to play with fiber finally was sort of fun, and I thought, wouldn't it be fun to make my own yarn to weave with? So I taught myself how to spin, and then I realized that it would be cheaper to get natural fiber and dye it myself instead of buying dyed fibers. So I thought, well, I'm going to start learning how to dye so I can dye it. And to be quite honest, when I was doing that, a lot of my friends said, well, I'll buy your fiber and buy your yarn. So for years, I kind of stopped weaving. And I did mostly the fiber side of things. And in the last year or two, I've just decided that, you know, this journey all for me started in fiber so that I could weave. So I'm feel like I'm kind of starting over. So I'm starting to kind of teach myself again things about weaving, you know, learn more about the language of weaving, pattern, structure. So yeah, that's kind of my story. For me, it all starts in the dye pot. I mean, this is a braid I dyed. So this is the raw fiber, and this is a type of wool, blue-faced Leicester, with some silk mixed in. And so it's already got kind of it's not bright white. So it has this nice sort of oatmeal color, and so some of it I've dyed. And what's nice about getting fiber that isn't white is that's okay, because this is then going to change the colors. If I did these colors on bright white, it would look completely different. But in the dye pot, some I intentionally put colors in different places. Sometimes I allow the color to move. And then what I think is fun is you put the color in and you look at how it mixes. And when you put in blues with orange, you're going to get a mix. Those are opposite colors on the color wheel, and it's going to give you muddy colors. And so where it muds up, that's another tone that I wouldn't have been able to put on here myself. So to me, that's the fun, is seeing what the dye pot gives you. And then sometimes it's not great, and you can always over dye. Over dyeing is a wonderful trick to solve any problems. But with this particular one, I spun this as a single yarn, and I spun some of this and ended up with this. And so you can kind of see how the colors are there, but because I've spun it with some natural, it mutes the whole thing. And you know, I'll probably put this in a scarf or a piece of clothing. It's very soft to the touch. So that's an example of how, and sometimes I just let the braid do the talking, this braid of fiber, instead of trying to mix it with other things. And here's a couple of other braids that just show you that you can play, you know, and get dark tones all the way to light. You never know what you're going to get. And then there can be times when I'm more intentional, you know, so this is where it's just wool, but I have a device called a blending board, and you can actually lay fibers on and mix in silks and sparkle and other things. And then for this, when you spin it, you just simply pull it out the end, and I can spin it. And so you could see it's going to be almost a rainbow effect. So that would be a way to spin this, or you can felt it. So this is where it's not just the wool, and I've actually used solid colored wools and laid them on the board in a way to create a different palette. So that's just another way to put color where you want it and be creative. So how a loom works is in essence, you've got a warp and a weft. And the warp is what goes on the loom. And you get to make decisions about how close or far apart those threads are, what colors they are, and how long it is. The longer the warp, the more you can weave. That would be a longer piece. and then the warp actually moves through a reed or a metal piece, which helps to separate the threads, and it also provides a beading action to pack your yarns as you move in advance. And then you have what's called harnesses or shafts, and so as the yarn moves through this area, you actually thread it through. And so this is probably the most tedious part of weaving, is you do have to thread it through these little heddles. It's a metal piece, or this is called Texsolve with an eye. But the advantage is that holds the thread in a certain location. So if I decide I want to move the shaft up, you can see how it's lifting part of my threads up, and this provides me the space to throw my weft yarn. And what's wonderful about weaving, it's very mathematical, is I can make decisions about which threads I want up and which threads I want down. And this particular loom has 8 shafts, so the more shafts you have, the more threading you've got, the more complicated or detailed you can make the pattern based on that lifting. And then all the yarns move through here, and then they wind on to what's called the back beam. And I have a weird bamboo placemat here because it keeps my threads separate. So the idea is that you want a certain amount of tension. If this was loose, when I lift my yarns, I want this to be tight so that none of these yarns are drooping, because that preserves my pattern and it gives you good structure. With weaving, you want to think always about making sure your end fabric is functional. It's not going to fall apart. And then you have the weft threads. So aside from all the decisions you can make about your warp, then you get to make decisions about your weft, how thick it is, what color it is. And so simply by opening up, and this is just an over-under pattern. So this is lifting every other thread 1 and 3 shafts, and that gives me a particular opening, and I pack that down. And then as you open that and do the 2nd and 4th, you're lifting every other thread but on the opposite, and so that gives you, this locks this thread in, and I can make another pass. And then you simply advance your weaving. Once you weave a certain amount, you'll kind of move this direction. You're going to lose space, so you have to wind this onto this cloth beam, and that gives you more space to weave, and you simply keep moving until you've used up all your warp, when all of the back threads have moved through. And then the real wonderful part is when you're finished weaving and you roll your cloth off. That's kind of this wonderful moment. You see all the hard work you've done. The other thing I do, and I play with a lot, is looking at the colors I've got going, and I have a mix of different yarns I could put in, and so then wanting to bring a color here over to this point, it tends to start to unify the piece. If you see sort of repetition and your eye can bounce between the same colors in a piece, that sometimes, for me, it makes sense. There's a rhythm there. The other thing you can do with this second yarns is I could choose, instead of making it the same colors, I could pick something that's contrasting, and then you're going to get more of an energy between the 2 yarns as they're woven. So a lot of the reason I like weaving is you can bring that, you can have control over that, which someone does in a painting. To me, it's kind of like a painting, although it's not, it's very abstract, not representational, but certainly you can bring in mood and energy and light, depending on how you play with things. I just pulled this off the loom, so for someone wondering what cloth looks like when it comes off, so this is a very long warp. So I put 8 yards of yarn and the striping color, so you can see the stripes of color I had in my warp on the loom. And then these are going to be kitchen towels. And mainly one of the best ways to play with pattern and start to understand or practice things is I make kitchen towels, because it's functional, and if it doesn't work, kitchen towels always work. So, and they're great gifts. But what's nice about this piece, if I can get to one end of it, is this was a pattern out of a book, and the book was, it showed it in black and white, but I don't really think in black and white. So did my colors this way, and then played with the warp. So this actually, you're running 2 shuttles at the same time, so you can get this diamond effect. And so this one I did all in pattern, and then this gets tedious to run 2 shuttles. So the next towel, I said, you know what, I'm just gonna weave white. And so this is just plain weave without a pattern going on, and every once in a while I threw in a different color weft just to break it up so it's a little bit not so monotonous. And then again, change the pattern. So again, it's similar to the other pattern, but a little bit different. And so that's honestly the fun of weaving, is by having your loom warped a certain way, how you treadle it, you can make a lot of decisions about what you want the piece to be. And to me, this makes a coordinating. No two of these are the same because I don't like doing things the same, but they work together. And then where I want to go with weaving is something like this. I took a workshop in Tennessee at Aramont on ikat from a woman who's quite an expert. But what this piece is about is using a resist, and you're using a resist in your warp and also in your weft. And it's a lot of forward thinking about where you want color to be and where you don't want it to be, and where you can layer color. So these pieces are a lot more involved. They take a lot more time. There's a lot of planning involved, and in fact with weaving, a lot of times I think what people realize is that you don't just sit down at the loom and start weaving. Half, I think, of a woven piece is the planning, and the planning of the warp and the preparation. So I would like to do more of this. What I like about these sorts of pieces is it's very similar in thinking, but I like that the color work, it's very abstract. I like the movement of the color and where you put the light and the dark. This one, for me, is very inspiring because it helps me remember. And as a weaver, a lot of times you do keep samples of little pieces, just because it reminds you of what you've done, what colors work, hand, texture, yarn, and where to go. So this is a shawl that I wove for myself, and wanted to play. When you spin yarn, you start to end up with a lot of yarn, and I wanted to use it. So this actually has a lot of hand spun yarn in it. So just to keep it simple, I put a black warp on, but then sometimes for me nothing is simple. And I wanted to see a little bit of color in the fringe. So, and I also realized, and I don't know if you can see this, but by putting some color in the warp, you get a little bit of a striping effect. It's extremely subtle, and depending on what's crossing it, it comes out or subsides, but that's just another design element. And then you can see here is some art yarn where the yarn itself has sequins and ribbons and all kinds of crazy stuff in it, locks. And so the idea is that as you're weaving, while this is a hand spun and you get color change, when you look at this as a whole, this becomes the ground, or kind of the background where your eye can rest. And then by throwing in a very thick piece of roving, which is just some roving I threw in the shed, and left it kind of chunky and fluffy. And then also here, where it's a different kind of yarn with a lot more color, that's an acid green, it's a little bit more vibrant, so it's bouncing against this. So this is where your eye goes, this is where your eye goes, and the rest of this becomes supporting cast, if you want to think of it like a theater production. And so you get this sort of gradation of color, and then as you're weaving, sometimes in doing these, you start to do these crazy pieces and think, I just made an enormous mistake, and that's not going to work. It's going to be to this or to that. But what I'm learning, the more I do these, is that it's really the sum of all parts. As a whole piece, it all works together and starts to make sense. And I suppose in a painting, you look for one focal point, and sometimes in a weaving, you can have that if it's a particular stripe, or a certain thing in the piece. But for me, these have maybe multiple focal points, and it just gives your eye a lot of different things to look at. Call it eye candy.